So how easy is it to install LokSound's new adapter board for Broadway Limited locomotives? Let's find out. Hi, I'm Dan Cortopassi. Welcome to DCC Shop. In this episode, I'm going to try out one of ESU's new adapter boards for Broadway Limited steam locomotives in my Great Northern S2484. I reviewed this Broadway Limited model on the channel a few years ago, and the review is still up if you'd like to check it out. It's a really nice looking model, but I've never been that happy with the DCC decoder. I haven't done anything to this engine since I reviewed it other than to change the couplers. I put Katy scale couplers on it and Katy coupler boxes because the Broadway boxes didn't really work very well. The front coupler was a little bit high, so I used a shim to lower it. The coupler on the tender was a little bit low, so I used a shim inside the coupler box to raise it a little. Other than that, this thing is completely stock. So this is the adapter board. It comes in a fairly large box, and it's part 53952 from ESU. So all that's in that kind of large box is a QR code to download some instructions and of course the board itself. So the board has a 21-pin plug. It's got some capacitors to help prevent stalling, and then of course all the connectors that should hook up to the existing wiring within the engine. Along with that, I'll be using a decoder number 58429. This is one of the standard ESU 21-pin LokSound 5 decoders. Before we get started, I should point out that the instructions say that this board is only for LokSound decoders, so you can't use it with other brands. Everything with this build should be inside the tender, and it took me a little while to figure out how to do this, but this little hatch opens and there's a screw in here using a small Phillips screwdriver. Once the screw is loose, the top should come off. Set that aside. Then I need to remove this little cross piece, which is another couple of screws. So it looks to me like these are all the same size screws. They look like maybe 2mm metric screws. But just to avoid any possible confusion, I'm keeping the screws with the parts that they came off of, so that when I go to put it back together, everything should, in theory, go back where it's supposed to go. So this next bit's a little hard to illustrate, but the board here, the BLI board that we want to take out, is screwed to a little metal bracket, and the metal bracket is fastened to the bottom of the tender with two screws, one here and one under this thing over on this side. So I need to take those out, and you got to reach down and kind of, it's going to be hard to show this on camera. I would highly recommend a magnetic screwdriver for this kind of a task because you don't want to lose the screws inside the tender. Now I can start to pull this board out. There's a little bit of slack in the wires, so it comes out like that. And there's a couple of screws that actually secure the board to the bracket, so I want to loosen those as well. And one just fell in, so I'll have to fish it out. Okay, it's just one screw. So I'm going to try to do this just like this because taking the whole tender apart is actually a bigger job than it looks. So according to the instructions, you just put the pins in the same positions as they were in the old board into the new board. The new board has a few more slots, I guess because it's designed to fit different BLI engines that may have different connections. But we just want to move all these connectors from one to the other. And as you can see, the ESU board's a little bit wider on one side than the BLI board. But the connections match up fairly well. ESU recommends you take a picture with your phone to make sure you get the wires in the right places. I'm going to try a slightly different approach and just pull one cord at a time. See if I can do this. There's not as much room in here as I'd like there to be. So you want to make sure it's hard to show. Sorry, my hand's getting in the way. I just can't do this any other way. But you want to pull the cords by the plug, not by the wires. I'm just going to set aside the old Broadway Limited board for now and probably wrap it up and put it in the box. I may eventually try to get it on eBay or something, but I want to hang on to it for a while until I'm happy with the operation with the new decoder. Before I put the decoder on the adapter board and put everything back together, I need to program the sounds in this thing. From what I understand, from what I've read and what other people have said, something about this arrangement doesn't allow you to program the sounds with this thing installed, so I'm going to have to do something else. LokSound doesn't have a specific sound file for a Great Northern S2. They have 3 different 484s. One's for the Milwaukee 261, they've got a Union Pacific 844 and an SP 4449. I chose 4449 because it has a Spokane, Portland, and Seattle whistle, which I figure is maybe close to a Great Northern whistle since SP&S was partly owned by Great Northern. If any of you are fans of Great Northern steam and you have better information on what kind of whistle I should use on this engine, please let me know in the comments. This is an Atlas -8 chassis. I'm using this one because it has a 21-pin connector and it also has speakers, so I'll be able to use this to install the sounds and also test them. By the way, if you're interested in how I set up this multi-gauge programming track, there's another video about that here on the channel in the DCC Shop series. I've set the address to 2584 and saved the sound file with the new name on my computer so I'll be able to find it later. I keep a custom sound file for all my LokSound equipped locomotives. The manual says to go to the Compatibility tab and click the box to enable BLI support. Next, I'm going to rename some of the function outputs. My engine doesn't have working marker lights, so some of this may not be necessary, but I'll follow the instructions anyway. I'm naming aux16 marker/number boards. aux17 is marker lights. And aux18 is for the cab light. aux5 needs to be set to dimmable headlight with brightness 31 and none of the boxes at the bottom checked. The instructions say to name it Power Enable, though the name is optional and you could really call it anything you want. aux6 needs to have the output mode set to Power Pack Control. I'm following the recommendation and setting the name to the same thing. Incidentally, the names aren't written to the decoder, but they are saved in the sound file if you save a copy to your computer. The manual says to set up the aux5 Power Enable output to be active on drive and stop to keep the lights functioning correctly. I deviated a little from the manual because I don't like the default Broadway cab light setup where the cab light comes on when the locomotive is stopped and goes out when it's running. I prefer manual control. The other lights can be mapped as you like. If you want to use the smoke unit, you have to map the smoke unit to the function key of your choice using the ESU smoke unit logical function. I don't want to use the smoke unit, so I'll leave this disabled. If your locomotive has a physical smoke unit switch, it also has to be on, otherwise the DCC function keys won't turn it on regardless of how it's programmed. The manual also has some recommendations for the smoke unit settings. I'm going to leave these alone since I'm not using it. BLI locomotives have a built-in chuff sensor. If you want to use it, then you need to go to the Sound Settings tab and set the chuffs to use external sensor. You can also use the software chuffs. It takes a little trial and error to dial this in. ESU decoders have excellent chuff sync, so if your locomotive doesn't have a sensor or if the sensor's gone bad, this is a good alternative. I had to do this off camera because it was just, there's just no room to film something like this. But I did get the decoder and the board, the adapter board, back into the tender. It took a little bit of fussy work because it's very tight and some of the wires are kind of short, and I had to be really careful. I almost broke one of the speaker wires, but fortunately I didn't. It sits at a slight angle, which is just because of the way the screw holes lined up. I don't think it's a big deal. You're not going to see that when the engine's put back together, but it is just something to be aware of, that it didn't quite fit the way the original board did. I put the rest of the tender back together. Now it's time to tweak some of the decoder settings. So I made a little bit of a mistake setting up the cab light earlier. I confused the output that's labeled cab light by default in the sound file with the cab light the instruction said to set up for the BLI adapter board. Now that I figured that out, I can turn the cab light on and off with F17, the key I chose for that purpose. If you're wondering why F17, it's because I have a standardized function key set up that I use for all my locomotives. I try to reserve the lower numbered keys for lights that are used more often in operation, like oscillating lights, ditch lights, beacons, etc. This locomotive doesn't have any of that, but I prefer keeping a standard rather than having to remember a different function key setup for every locomotive. Better yet, control of the cab light is no longer affected by the engine's motion. It's just a simple on and off when I toggle the F17 key. I tried turning down the brightness, but the brightness slider seems to have no effect on the light at all. The manual does seem to indicate that there is circuitry inside the locomotive that may limit how you can program some of the lights. By the way, I put the model up on some of these Bachmann rollers, which is really handy when you're doing things like adjusting the chuff rate, since the model will stay stationary and you can just watch the wheels go around. The chuff rate was a little off when I first tested the model. I had to adjust the slider that's labeled trigger impulses down from the default 20 to 12. This was as close as I could get. Considering that the model has a sensor, I was kind of surprised that any adjustment would be needed, but I'm guessing maybe the sensor is actually on the motor and not on the axle. That would kind of make sense, that you have to have a ratio for how many times the motor turns versus how many times the axle turns. At 20, the model didn't have enough chuffs per revolution. I went down to 8 and then it had way too many. I eventually settled on 12 to get 4 chuffs per revolution. To get it totally perfect, the number would have to be somewhere between 12 and 13, but the software doesn't allow for fractions. The slight mismatch between chuffs and wheel motion is only noticeable if you really stare at the model for a long period of time. I think it's more than good enough for normal operation. I also turned down the chuff volume as it was really loud by default. I played around with some of the other volume settings as well. So one thing I like with these sound files is that there is an information tab, and this is just basically text that you can read. It's kind of the same as what's on the website, but it's kind of handy to have it here in the programmer. And you can see, like, here's all the different whistles. There's a UP844 steamboat whistle. There's the SPNS 3 chime, which is the one I chose. And then there's some others, including 4449, of course, since this is the file for 4449. And then there's also different bells. And there's different dynamo sounds if you really want to get into the weeds with this stuff, and air pumps, and etc. So this kind of takes the guesswork out of, figuring out what's what. So as you can see, the headlight works. And the backup light works. I'm pretty happy with the sound and the overall performance of the engine. So one other thing I want to do to this that really has nothing to do with the decoder is the headlight. There's an LED in there, but it's really recessed into that little hole in the middle of the headlight, and it kind of looks like a little pinpoint of light inside the larger headlight. And I want to see if I can do something about that. There's a round plastic lens on the front of the headlight, and the easiest way, I think, to remove it is to use some tape. Yep, and there it is. It came off. The lens is right there. It's a little hard to see because it's clear, of course, but I'm just going to leave it on the tape so I don't lose it. I'm going to use a lighter and flare a lens on the end of some 30 thousandths fiber optics. It took a few tries to get a lens that I was happy with. I cut the stem really short. I'm going to use a little dab of this Zap Formula 560 canopy glue, which is a water-soluble glue, and it dries clear, so it's really good for doing clear parts and lenses and things like that. I use some scrap wire as an applicator to just put a tiny dab of glue inside the headlight. It's really hard to show this on camera, but to me the fiber optic looks like it's scattering the light a little bit around the reflector and the lens, so it makes it look a little more realistic. So that's it. It's basically done. I'm pretty happy with it. I think the motor control is definitely improved, and I also like that the lighting is more normal in terms of what I expect. There's not some of the automated behaviors that BLI seems to like to put in their decoders. So all of that to me is a benefit. It sounds really good too, I think. I still need to tweak some of the automated sounds. There's some stuff happening that, you know, may need to be changed, but overall I'm pretty happy with it. Also, I should point out that using the Loc programmer hasn't been a problem at all with this thing, so I think it's just the initial setup maybe that you need to use a different something to program the decoder, and then you know, like the other chassis like I used, and once that's done, then it seems to work fine. So in terms of pros and cons, I think the biggest pro is that this can be done without soldering. I think it's well within the capabilities of the average modeler. And you don't have to take the engine apart at all. You just, you know, have to access the tender, which is a lot easier. Usually the tenders are easier to take apart than the locomotive. So if you're a little nervous about tearing into a, you know, $600 brass hybrid engine, you don't need to worry about it too much. You just, you know, everything is in the tender. I think the biggest con is that there are some limitations on the lighting functions. But if you can live with that, then this is definitely an easy way to swap out the original decoder for a LokSound. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how this turned out. I think it's a big improvement. If you like this video, then please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned, and thanks for watching.